The Dam Square in Amsterdam sits at the center of one of the most visited cities in Europe. Tourists move across its wide paving stones in every direction. Trams cut through the edges of the crowd. The royal palace anchors one side with its pale stone facade. Pigeons circle above everything, unimpressed by all of it. Almost nobody standing there knows they are standing on a dam. The actual dam, the physical structure of earth and timber and stone that gave this city its name, is buried somewhere beneath those paving stones. It was built across the Amstel River sometime in the 13th century by people whose names we do not know, who were trying to solve a problem much smaller than the one they accidentally created. They wanted to keep water off their fields. What they built instead was the starting point for one of the most consequential commercial experiments in human history. The city that grew from that dam should not exist. It was built on ground below sea level, on soft peat that swallows foundations, in a location that every engineering logic of the age said was unsuitable for any settlement of significance. The people who built it had no vision of what it would become. They were solving immediate problems with available tools, the way practical people always do. But the tools they developed for solving those problems, specifically the tools for sharing risk across a community of people who could not survive the problem alone, turned out to be applicable far beyond the drainage ditch and the dike, applied over centuries to maritime trade, to long-distance commerce, to the financing of voyages to the other side of the world. Those tools became the financial infrastructure that much of the modern corporate world still runs on today. This is the story of Amsterdam, a city that started as a dam and ended up financing the modern world. Chapter 1. The City That Should Not Exist. On a grey morning in the late 13th century, a man we can call Hendrik checked the water level in the drainage ditch behind his house. He did this every morning. So did everyone else in the settlement. You checked the water level the way you checked whether your fire was still burning, not because you expected a crisis, but because failing to check was itself the beginning of one. In the low-lying delta where Hendrik lived, where the Amstel River met the tidal inlet that would eventually be managed into the harbour of Amsterdam. The gap between watchfulness and catastrophe was measured in hours. A blocked ditch could flood a field overnight. A weakened embankment could collapse in a single storm surge and take everything a family had worked for in a season. Hendrik is a composite figure, drawn from what archaeology and the earliest surviving records tell us about the people who built this place. He is not a specific named individual from history, but the work he is doing and the problems he faces are real. Documented in the physical record of the landscape and in the waterboard, documents that began accumulating in this region from the 12th and 13th centuries onward. He stands for thousands of people whose individual names did not survive, but whose collective decisions shaped everything that came after. Now start with the ground he is standing on, because you cannot understand this city without it. Amsterdam sits in the Western Netherlands on what was, before human intervention, the soft delta margin of several rivers meeting the sea. The soil is peat and clay, compressed organic matter laid down over thousands of years of wetland accumulation. Peat is not good building material. It is compressible, water-saturated, and prone to shrinkage when drained. Many major buildings in Amsterdam's historic centre rest on wooden piles driven through the peat to reach the firmer sand layers below. The Royal Palace on Dam Square rests on approximately 13,000 wooden piles. That is not a foundation. That is a calculated argument with geology. The city averages roughly half a meter to a meter below sea level, depending on location and measurement. The North Sea to the west and the rivers flowing from the east create a permanent hydraulic pressure against which the city has been defending itself for 8 centuries. This is not a historical curiosity. It is an ongoing engineering reality requiring constant, active management. The moment that management stops, the water returns. It always has. It always will. The people who chose to settle here in the 12th and 13th centuries knew this. They chose it anyway, for reasons that made complete sense given their alternatives. The low-lying coastal regions of the Netherlands were among the most fertile agricultural land in Northern Europe, provided you could keep them drained. Access to the sea and the river networks meant access to trade. And in a period when most ordinary people had very little choice about where they lived, marginal land that required labor to make productive was often the only land available to those without wealth or noble status. What this landscape demanded, immediately and without negotiation, was collective action. You could not drain a peat bog alone. A single family could not maintain a dike. The drainage ditches that made farming possible ran across multiple land holdings and required cooperative management. The dikes that held back the rivers were community infrastructure, built and maintained by everyone in the system or abandoned by everyone in the system. There was no middle position. From this collective necessity came one of the most distinctive institutions in Dutch history. The water boards, the governing bodies responsible for managing dikes and drainage across the region, are among the oldest continuously operating democratic institutions in Europe, predating most national parliaments by generations. Their decisions were binding on everyone in the managed area regardless of social status. Because the water did not respect hierarchy. If the lord of the manor refused to contribute to dike maintenance and the dike failed, the lord drowned alongside his tenants. The water boards created, over generations, a culture of negotiated collective decision-making built not on principle but on the practical fact that the alternative to cooperation was drowning. That culture would express itself in very different contexts across the following centuries. But in Hendrik's time, it was simply the way things worked. You maintained the ditch. You attended the water board meeting. You contributed labor to the dike repair when the board required it. You did these things not because you were especially civic-minded, but because the people who did not do them ended up underwater. The first written record of the settlement appears in a document from the year 1275. Floris V, Count of Holland, granted the people living at the dam on the Amstel an exemption from tolls on goods they transported through Holland by water. The document is the founding charter of Amsterdam not because it created the settlement, which already existed, but because it is the earliest surviving evidence that the place had a name, a defined community, and a relationship with a political authority worth formalizing in writing. The toll exemption tells you several things about Amsterdam that would prove permanent. The community was already trading before the charter was issued. They were moving goods on the water, participating in commercial networks extending beyond their immediate neighborhood. and Floris gave them the exemption not out of generosity but because he found it useful. A community of active traders at a strategic point on the waterway was worth cultivating rather than simply taxing. The relationship between Amsterdam and whoever nominally governed it was, from this first surviving document, a matter of mutual practical benefit rather than loyalty or sentiment. That disposition would never entirely leave the city. The dam itself, the physical structure that gave Amsterdam its name, sat where the Amstel met the body of water that would eventually become the harbour. It controlled the flow between river and sea and served as a loading point where goods were transferred between the smaller river boats coming down from the interior and the larger vessels capable of handling the open water beyond. This function, the transit point between different scales of transport, between local and long distance, between fresh and salt water, was not incidental to the city's early character. It was the city's first commercial identity. The city that grew up around the dam was small and would remain small for a long time. The population in 1275 was probably a few hundred people at most. The buildings were timber, built on those piles, close together along the banks of the Amstel. The church that would eventually become the Oude Kerk, the old church and the oldest surviving building in Amsterdam, was already taking shape in some form by the late 13th century. When you visit the Oude Kerk today and walk across its floor of worn medieval tombstones, you are standing on the oldest physical layer of the city that still exists above ground. But the most important thing about Amsterdam in 1275 was not what it was. It was what it was practicing becoming. The fish trade that would drive the city's first real commercial expansion was already establishing itself. Herring from the North Sea, salted and packed in barrels, was one of the most economically important commodities in medieval Northern Europe. The grain trade from the Baltic, moving westward through Amsterdam on its way to the markets of Western Europe, was beginning to flow. The skills of maritime risk management that would eventually produce the VOC were being developed, slowly and practically, by fishermen and merchants trying not to lose everything when their ships did not come back. Hendrik, checking his drainage ditch on a grey morning in the late 13th century, was not building civilization. He was managing water, but the habits of mind his landscape demanded of him, the instinct to think collectively, to share risk, to maintain systems that no individual could sustain alone, were the same habits that his city would eventually apply to the most ambitious commercial experiment the world had yet seen. He did not know that. Neither did anyone else. The water kept rising, the people kept building, and in that perpetual negotiation between a settlement and the element that surrounded it, something was being made that would outlast everyone involved in making it. Chapter 2. Herring, Beer, and the First Trade Network. In the summer of 1360, a merchant we can call Willem Claes sat in a warehouse near the Amsterdam Dam and tried to decide whether a Baltic voyage was worth the risk. The ship he was considering investing in was bound for the Baltic coast, carrying salt from Iberia to exchange for grain and timber in the ports of what is now Poland and the Baltic states. The voyage would take weeks. The ship might encounter storms. It might encounter the pirates who worked the sea lanes between Scandinavia and the German coast. The captain was known to Willem, but not well known. The potential return on a successful voyage was substantial. The loss on a failed one would be painful, though not ruinous if he was careful about how much he committed. Willem Klaas is a composite figure, drawn from the documented commercial culture of 14th century Amsterdam rather than from a specific surviving record. But the calculation he is working through was real and was being worked through, in different, specific forms, by Amsterdam merchants throughout this period. How do you manage risk across multiple ventures? How do you share the downside with other investors without giving away too much of the upside? How do you assess the reliability of partners you cannot personally supervise across hundreds of miles of open water? These questions, refined over generations, were building something that nobody in 1360 had a name for yet. The herring of the North Sea was the economic engine of this world, and it is worth understanding exactly why. The Catholic calendar required Christians to abstain from eating meat on Fridays, Saturdays, the eves of saints' days, and throughout the 40 days of Lent, adding up to roughly 150 days per year on which the Christian population of Europe could not eat meat. They needed protein from another source. Fish was the answer, and herring, which could be caught in vast quantities, salt preserved in barrels, and transported across hundreds of miles of road and river without spoiling, was the most practical fish for feeding large populations far from the sea. Demand was effectively guaranteed by the church calendar and enforced by religious obligation. The markets stretched from the Baltic coast to the inland cities of Germany, France, and the Iberian Peninsula. Whoever could supply it reliably and at competitive prices would find themselves at the center of a commercial network of continental reach. The Dutch were positioning themselves to do exactly that. The competitive advantage they developed was technical, earned rather than inherited. Dutch fishermen developed a method for gutting and salting herring at sea, preserving the catch in the hold immediately after landing it rather than waiting until the boats returned to port. The technique produced a significantly better quality preserved fish with a longer shelf life than anything competitors could offer. Dutch herring commanded premium prices across European markets. It could travel further and arrive in better condition. The name attached to this innovation in Dutch historical tradition is Willem Boykels, a fisherman from the coastal village of Beverwijk. Credited with perfecting the technique sometime in the late 14th century, whether one man truly invented it or whether this is the kind of tidy historical compression that reality rarely provides is impossible to determine from surviving evidence. What is certain is that the technique was real. The Dutch adopted it more systematically than their competitors, and the commercial advantage it created was substantial and sustained. What the herring trade was building, beneath the smell of salt and fish gut, was something more durable than any individual cargo. Consider what running a Baltic trading voyage in the 1300s actually required. You needed capital to outfit a ship and acquire cargo. You needed agents at the other end who could sell what you brought and source what you wanted to return with. You needed a way to extend credit across distances so large that you could not personally supervise the transaction. You needed contracts enforceable even when one party was weeks of sailing away. And you needed some mechanism for managing the catastrophic risk that the ship, the cargo, or both might not come back at all. The water boards had taught the Dutch something important about institutions. A collective problem, faced honestly. requires a collective structure to manage it. The flood does not care about your preference for individual action. It comes regardless. The merchants of Amsterdam applied the same logic to commerce. Risk shared is risk reduced. Contracts honored because dishonoring them destroys the network that everyone depends on. Accounting done carefully because money lost in bad record-keeping is money gone permanently. These were not abstract principles. They were learned behaviors, reinforced by experience over generations, expressed in the specific structure of how Amsterdam merchants organized their businesses. By the mid-14th century, Amsterdam had become a significant player in the Baltic grain trade, importing rye and wheat from Poland and Prussia and distributing them through the river networks of Western Europe. The city was also deeply involved in the timber trade from the Baltic forests, feeding the demand for construction materials in the growing cities of the West. Salt from the Iberian Peninsula moved through Amsterdam northward. Cloth from the English wool trade moved through in the other direction. And beer. It deserves its own moment. The Amsterdam brewing industry of the 14th and 15th centuries was one of the city's most important commercial enterprises. Hopped beer, which had longer shelf life than the traditional grain beverages it gradually displaced, was an export commodity that travelled well. Hamburg had been the dominant exporter of hopped beer to the Low Countries and England in the early 14th century. By the mid-14th century, Amsterdam brewers had developed their production to the point where they were competing directly and winning. Dozens of breweries operated in the city, and beer joined grain, fish, and timber as a major item in its export trade. The brewing industry mattered for two reasons beyond the revenue. First, it required large quantities of imported grain, meaning Amsterdam's grain trade was partly feeding its own production sector. The linkages between different parts of the commercial network were strengthening, making the whole system more resilient. Second, brewing required capital, expertise, and continuous investment in equipment and infrastructure. The merchants running Amsterdam's breweries were the same people, or directly connected to the same people, managing its trading houses and maritime ventures. Capital moved fluidly between sectors because the people managing it were accustomed to thinking across sectors. Cities where capital remains locked in single industries develop more slowly than cities where money and expertise move across boundaries. Amsterdam, by the mid-15th century, had already developed the commercial flexibility that would serve it spectacularly when everything around it changed. By that mid-15th century, the city had between 10,000 and 15,000 inhabitants. Bruges and Antwerp in the Low Countries were larger and wealthier. The great Hanseatic ports of Hamburg and Lübeck were more powerful in the Baltic. Amsterdam was not yet the center of the world. It was one player among many, better positioned than most, more commercially sophisticated than its modest size suggested. And Willem Claes, closing his accounts book at the end of that summer afternoon in 1360, had made his decision. He put in less than he could afford to lose. He spread the rest across two other ventures. He did not know he was practicing the logic of portfolio diversification 6 centuries before anyone gave it that name. He was just trying not to go broke. The catastrophe that would accelerate everything his city was building was still more than 2 centuries away. It would come from the south, from a peninsula where 2 crowns were beginning to dream about an ocean they had not yet fully crossed. Chapter 3. The Revolt That Built a Nation. On a November morning in 1576, a woman named Maria Pipes stood in the doorway of her house in Antwerp and watched soldiers loot her neighbor's warehouse. The soldiers were Spanish. They had not been paid in months. Some accounts suggest more than a year. 3 days earlier, they had mutinied, and what followed became known across Europe as the Spanish Fury. 3 days of murder and plunder in which Spanish troops killed somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people in one of the most prosperous commercial cities in the world and burned a significant portion of it to the ground. Maria survived. Many of her neighbors did not. The commercial networks she had spent years building, the trust and credit and personal relationships that made trade possible, were dissolving in smoke and blood around her. Maria Pipes is a composite figure, representative of the tens of thousands of Antwerp's merchants, financiers, skilled craftsmen, and traders who faced, in the weeks and months after the Fury, the most consequential decision of their commercial lives: whether to stay and rebuild in a city controlled by an empire that could not or would not discipline its own troops, or to leave. Most of them left, and where they went would determine the shape of European commerce for the next century. To understand what they were fleeing and where they were going, you need to understand the Habsburgs. The Habsburg dynasty, by the reign of Philip II of Spain, controlled a collection of territories that included Spain, the Spanish Americas, southern Italy, Austria, Bohemia, and the 17 provinces of the Low Countries. Those small provinces clustered around the mouths of the Rhine, Maas, and Scheldt rivers were among the most economically valuable pieces of the entire Habsburg collection. Antwerp, the commercial capital of those provinces, was in the 1560s one of the most important commercial cities in northern Europe. With a population of roughly 100,000 and a commodity exchange, the Bourse, established in 1531. That was one of the models for commercial exchanges across the continent. Philip II had been born in Spain and thought in Spanish categories. He viewed the Protestant ideas spreading through the Low Countries, Calvinist theology in particular, as heresy requiring elimination. In 1567, he sent the Duke of Alba to govern the provinces with instructions to restore Catholic orthodoxy by whatever means necessary. The Council of Blood that Alba established executed thousands, confiscated property on a large scale, and imposed new taxation that struck directly at the commercial interests of the merchant class. The Low Countries revolted. The leader who emerged was William I, Prince of Orange, known as William the Silent, a title referring not to conversational habits but to political shrewdness, and the ability to hold his counsel when speaking too freely would have been fatal. His early military campaigns against Spain failed. The Spanish forces were more numerous, better equipped, and more experienced. The cause looked hopeless to any objective observer. What the Spanish could not defeat was a population that refused to accept it had been defeated. The Dutch had one advantage no army could easily address: the water. The relief of Leiden in 1574, when William ordered the dikes cut so that a fleet could sail across flooded farmland to break a Spanish siege, was the most dramatic demonstration of this principle. It ruined an enormous area of agricultural land. It saved the city. And it established a precedent the Spanish never successfully countered. The Dutch were prepared to destroy their own country rather than allow Spain to govern it. After Leiden came an act of institution building that tells you what the revolt was actually for. In 1575, William founded the University of Leiden as a gift to the city that had suffered in the cause. It was a declaration in institutional form that this was a permanent project. Not merely resistance, but the creation of something new. A society that valued learning and free inquiry as part of its foundation. The Union of Utrecht in 1579 brought 7 northern provinces into formal military alliance. The Act of Abjuration in 1581 declared them independent of Philip II. The Republic of the 7 United Netherlands was, by the political standards of the age, almost unprecedented. The dominant powers of Europe were monarchies. Here was a republic governed by merchant oligarchies. Announcing that it intended to exist on its own terms, Philip did not take this seriously enough. He should have. Now here is the moment this story reaches its real turning point. Not a battle, not a treaty, a city's catastrophe that became another city's transformation. In 1585, the Spanish army under the Duke of Parma besieged and captured Antwerp after a prolonged siege that had lasted more than a year. The Spanish then imposed a blockade of the Scheldt River, the waterway giving Antwerp access to the sea. Without sea access, a port city dies. And beyond the blockade, the reimposition of religious orthodoxy made the city inhospitable to the Protestant merchant community that had driven its commercial vitality. Maria Pipes, and the tens of thousands like her, made their calculations and left. What followed was one of the largest migrations of commercial talent in early modern European history. The merchants, financiers, skilled craftsmen, diamond cutters, printers, and cartographers of Antwerp moved north, in enormous numbers, to the republic that had promised to let them live and work and worship as they chose, to Amsterdam. Amsterdam's population roughly doubled in the 2 decades after 1585, by some historical estimates, but the raw numbers are less important than what came with the people. They brought capital. They brought commercial networks extending to every major port in Europe and the Mediterranean. They brought expertise in the financial instruments that Antwerp's Boers had pioneered. They brought the Sephardic Jewish merchants who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal and who carried trade networks reaching to the Ottoman Empire and beyond. In the space of roughly 15 years, Amsterdam absorbed the commercial knowledge of one of the greatest trading cities in Northern Europe. Now consider what Amsterdam already had before this migration arrived. A century and a half of experience managing maritime risk. Institutional infrastructure for collective decision-making built through centuries of water management. A geographic position giving access to both Baltic and Atlantic trade routes. A political framework. The new republic, committed in principle to the idea that people of different backgrounds could live and work and trade together without enforced religious conformity. What the Antwerp migration added to this foundation was the knowledge, the capital, and the networks to operate at genuinely global scale. The combination was unprecedented. Nothing quite like it had existed before. Maria Pipes eventually settled in Amsterdam. On a street not far from the harbour, she rebuilt her trading networks from a new address, in a new city, with the same contacts and the same commercial instincts and the same meticulous attention to credit and reputation that had made her successful in Antwerp. She was one of thousands doing the same thing simultaneously. And the cumulative effect of all those individual acts of reconstruction was a city that had absorbed the commercial brain of the greatest trading city in Northern Europe and was about to do something with it that nobody had anticipated. The Portuguese, without intending to, were about to give them the problem that would make it necessary to invent something entirely new. Chapter 4. The VOC and the Birth of the Corporation. Start with the problem the Portuguese created. In 1498, the navigator Vasco da Gama completed the first European sea voyage to India by sailing around the southern tip of Africa, establishing a direct maritime route between Europe and the spice-producing regions of Asia. For Lisbon, it was the beginning of an era of extraordinary wealth. For the merchants of Northern Europe, who had previously obtained Asian spices through overland routes controlled by Ottoman and Arab intermediaries, it was a demonstration that a sea route existed, and an immediate strategic problem. The Portuguese controlled that route and intended to keep controlling it. They fortified key points along the way. They built armed trading posts at Goa on the Indian coast, at Malacca controlling the straits into the South China Sea, at Hormuz controlling the Persian Gulf. They used violence freely against competitors. The Estado da India, the Portuguese trading empire in Asia, was less a commercial enterprise than a militarized monopoly, extracting fees from regional trade and using gunpowder weapons against anyone who refused to pay. For the Dutch, who by the 1590s were fighting for their political independence from Spain and Portugal, now united under one crown, accessing the spice trade directly had become a matter of strategic survival. Philip II had closed the port of Lisbon to Dutch ships. The Lisbon market had been the primary source through which Dutch merchants obtained spices for redistribution across Northern Europe. Closing it was economic warfare. The Dutch response was characteristic. They decided to go and get the spices themselves. The first Dutch expedition to Asia departed in 1595 under Cornelis de Houtman, whose navigational competence was considerably more limited than his commercial ambition. The voyage was difficult. Disease killed a large portion of the crew. Relations with populations they reached were damaged by de Houtman's aggressive behavior. The ships that returned to Amsterdam in 1597 brought a modest cargo barely sufficient to cover costs. By most standards, a failure. By the standards of the age of exploration, barely enough. It proved the route was navigable. Dutch ships could reach Asia and return, and it triggered a reaction nobody had planned. Everyone rushed to do it at once. Within a few years, more than a dozen competing Dutch companies had outfitted expeditions to Asia, each trying to establish its own trade relationships and supply networks. The result was commercial chaos. Competing Dutch ships arrived at the same ports, bidding against each other, driving up prices at the source while flooding the European market and driving prices down at the destination. The merchants backing these ventures were not making the profits the spice trade was supposed to deliver. They were paying each other's costs. The solution required someone to think at a scale that individual merchants, motivated by their own competitive interests, could not easily reach. That person was Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the advocate of Holland and the most powerful political figure in the Dutch Republic at the turn of the 17th century. Van Oldenbarnevelt saw the problem clearly. The Dutch were competing against the Portuguese Empire, a single state-backed monopoly with military power. Competing with a dozen small private companies working against each other was irrational. The only way to match a monopoly was with a monopoly. And the only way to create a monopoly large enough to challenge the Portuguese across an entire ocean was to merge the competing companies into a single entity, backed by the full political and ultimately military authority of the Republic. On the 20th of March, 1602, the Staten-Generaal issued the charter establishing the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, the VOC. The charter, according to VOC historical records, established an initial capital of approximately 6,400,000 guilders. Raised from investors across the Dutch Republic, it granted the company a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope for an initial period of 21 years. It authorized the company to build fortresses, negotiate treaties, maintain armed forces, and conduct war on behalf of the Dutch Republic in Asia. The VOC was not merely a trading company. It was, in the territories it controlled, a government. But the feature of the VOC that would matter most for subsequent history was not its monopoly rights or its military powers. It was its financial structure. Before the VOC, the standard model for organizing a long-distance trading voyage was the partnership. Investors pooled money for a specific venture, shared profits when ships returned, and dissolved the partnership. The model worked reasonably for shorter voyages. It failed for voyages to Asia, which could take 2 years or more, during which investors' capital was entirely committed and entirely illiquid. If you needed money while the ships were at sea, you could not get it. The VOC solved this by creating a permanent company with an ongoing capital base. Investors bought shares in the company itself rather than in a specific voyage. And crucially, those shares could be sold. If you owned VOC shares and needed money, you did not wait for the company to wind up its affairs. You sold your shares to someone else. The company continued operating regardless. Your exit did not require the enterprise to end. This was genuinely new at this scale. Earlier forms of transferable investment had existed in various places. Medieval Italian trading partnerships, the commenda used in Mediterranean commerce, had some features in common. But the VOC combined, in a single institution at unprecedented scale, 4 elements that together created something qualitatively different from what had come before. A permanent capital base, transferable shares, limited liability protecting investors from losing more than their investment, and the separation between ownership and management. The principle of limited liability deserves specific attention because it is the one most directly connecting the VOC to the economy of today. Before limited liability became standard for corporations, investing in a commercial venture exposed you to the full extent of that venture's losses. If the company went bankrupt, creditors could pursue your personal assets beyond what you had invested. This meant only wealthy people who could absorb catastrophic losses had rational reason to invest in high-risk, long-distance trade. Limited liability changed that calculation completely. If the worst happened, you lost what you put in and nothing more. Not your house, not your savings beyond the investment, just what you chose to risk. This made investment accessible to people of moderate means. It broadened the pool of available capital, and it created the virtuous cycle of investor confidence and commercial expansion that has characterized publicly traded companies ever since. The VOC's initial capital was raised from investors across the Dutch Republic. Amsterdam contributed the largest share. But the remarkable thing about the investor list is not the large merchants at the top. It is the breadth, smaller merchants, craftsmen, people of modest means who saw an opportunity and put in what they could afford. The VOC was, by the standards of its time, a genuinely popular investment. When you buy a share in any publicly traded company today, you are participating in a structure that is, in its fundamental logic, the same as what the VOC established in 1602: limited liability, transferable shares, permanent capital base, separation of ownership and management. The specific legal frameworks differ. The regulatory environments are unrecognizable. The scale is vastly larger, but the underlying mechanism is the same. The people who designed the VOC Charter were not trying to create one of the most influential blueprints in the history of the modern corporation. They were trying to solve a specific problem. How do you raise enough money to challenge a Portuguese empire across an entire ocean? The blueprint they created to solve that problem turned out to be applicable to almost any large commercial enterprise that came after it. The VOC went to work with a thoroughness that alarmed the Portuguese. Within a decade, VOC fleets were establishing fortified trading posts across Asia. Batavia, established in 1619 on the island of Java, became the administrative capital of the VOC's Asian operations. The methods used to establish and maintain these positions were frequently brutal. The conquest of the Banda Islands in 1621 under the VOC's Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen resulted in the destruction of the indigenous Bandanese population through violence, forced labor, and starvation. Historical research by scholars including Willard Hanna and Vincent Loth, working from VOC records and contemporary accounts, indicates the Banda population fell from an estimated 15,000 before the VOC's arrival to fewer than 1,000 within years. The nutmeg monopoly that followed was built on an atrocity whose scale and deliberateness the historical record documents in detail. This is not a footnote to the VOC's history. It is part of the same story as the financial innovation. The same institution that pioneered the corporate structure also exercised sovereign violence over Asian populations with a comprehensiveness that sits with difficulty alongside any uncomplicated celebration of what it achieved. The wealth flowing from the Banda spice monopoly into Amsterdam funded the canal houses and the artworks and the financial institutions of the Golden Age. The people of Banda paid a price for that funding that no investment prospectus recorded and no share price reflected. The financial innovation and the colonial violence were not separate sides of the same coin. They were functionally connected. The limited liability structure enabled investors to participate in profitable but risky colonial ventures without personal ruin. The colonial ventures generated the profits that made the shares valuable. Each required the other. Back in Amsterdam, the VOC shares were doing something nobody had quite anticipated. They were being traded, and the market that developed around them was about to change the world again. Chapter 5: The Stock Exchange and the Invention of Financial Time. On a spring morning in 1603, a merchant named Isaac Lemaire walked from his house on the Keizersgracht toward the open space near the dam where other merchants gathered every morning to trade. Lemaire was one of the VOC's original major investors. He had put a significant sum into the company at its founding and received shares in return. He had also, in the months since, begun developing serious doubts about the company's management. The directors, the Heren 17 who governed the VOC, were making decisions he considered damaging to shareholders' interests. He was building grievances that would eventually make him one of the most consequential figures in the early history of financial markets, for reasons he had not yet fully formulated. But on this particular morning, he was doing something simpler. He was checking the price of VOC shares and deciding what to do about it. Trading of VOC shares began almost immediately after the company's founding in 1602, conducted in the open air around the Dam Square and in the streets nearby. Merchants and investors met to negotiate prices and exchange documents. It was informal, improvised, and immediately recognizable to anyone who has watched a modern financial market. The same impulses that drive trading today, the calculation of value under uncertainty, the attempt to profit from knowing something others do not, the management of risk through buying and selling positions, were all present from the first days VOC shares changed hands. The Beurs, Amsterdam's formal exchange building, was completed in 1611. It gave the city's trading tradition a permanent physical home, a covered arcade surrounding a central courtyard where merchants could meet and trade regardless of the weather. It was also, from very early in its existence, the primary venue where VOC shares changed hands, and what happened with those shares in the first decades of the 17th century was that Amsterdam merchants began to develop, through the practical pressure of trying to make money. A set of financial instruments and techniques the world had never seen deployed at anything approaching this scale. Start with the secondary market, the most fundamental innovation. When you buy a share in a company today, you almost certainly buy it from someone who already owns it and wants to sell, not from the company itself. The company issued the shares originally, but the market where those shares now trade is between investors. This seems so obvious it barely registers as a concept. In 1602, it was genuinely new at this scale, and it mattered enormously because it solved the liquidity problem that had always made long-term investment difficult. Once there was a reliable place where shares could be sold at prices determined by willing buyers, the calculation of whether to invest changed. You were no longer committing capital permanently. You were committing it until you chose to exit. The futures contract appeared in Amsterdam in the earliest years of VOC trading. Two parties agreed today that one would sell a specified number of shares to the other at a specified price on a future date. Regardless of what the market price actually was on that date, if the price rose, the buyer profited. If it fell, the seller did. Neither needed to own the shares today. They were making a structured bet on the future price of an asset. The option contract took this further. An option gave one party the right but not the obligation to buy or sell shares at a specified price within a specified time. You paid a premium for this right. If the price moved in your favor, you exercised the option and profited. If it did not, you lost only the premium. The option was, in its structure, a form of insurance against adverse price movements. The man whose observations provide the most detailed surviving account of these practices is Joseph de la Vega, a Sephardic Jewish merchant whose book Confusion de Confusions, published in Amsterdam in 1688, is one of the earliest and most detailed surviving accounts of stock market operations anywhere. The La Vega was a participant, not merely an observer, and his account captures both the techniques and the psychological atmosphere of trading with a vividness that makes it readable more than 300 years later. He describes the euphoria of rising markets, the panic of falling ones, the strategies of bears profiting from decline and bulls betting on rise, the manipulation of prices through rumor and coordinated action, the ruin of those who overextend themselves on borrowed money. Reading de la Vega today, the most striking thing is not how exotic the Amsterdam market seems. It is how familiar, which brings us back to Isaac Le Maire, who had been building his grievances for several years. In the period after 1605, Le Maire organized what historians now recognize as the first recorded bear raid in financial history. Working with associates, he sold VOC shares short on a large scale, simultaneously spreading negative information about the company's prospects, driving the price down and profiting from the decline. The VOC's directors lobbied successfully for a government prohibition on short selling in 1610. The prohibition did not work, as prohibitions on short selling have rarely worked since. The practice continued because it served genuine economic functions, allowing investors to express negative assessments of asset values rather than only positive ones. The debate about its legitimacy and regulation that began in Amsterdam in 1610 continues in financial markets around the world today. The Amsterdamse Wisselbank, the Bank of Amsterdam, was established by the city government in 1609. Its motivation was a practical problem. The Dutch Republic, as a trading hub for goods from across Europe and the world, had accumulated an extraordinary diversity of currencies in circulation: Spanish reales, German talos, English pounds, Venetian ducats, Danish marks, and dozens of other coin types, all circulated in Amsterdam, each of slightly different weight and purity, each requiring conversion calculations before any transaction could be completed. The Bank of Amsterdam solved this by accepting deposits of coin of any type, assessing their actual metal content, and crediting the depositor with an account balance denominated in a standardized bank money called bank guilders. Bank guilders were defined by a fixed silver content and maintained that definition with notable consistency over the following decades. Transactions between merchants holding accounts at the bank could be settled by simple book transfers. No physical coin needed to change hands. The bank's records were the settlement mechanism. This was not lending. The Bank of Amsterdam, in its original form, did not lend money. It was a custody and transfer institution. But what it provided was something commercial life had always needed and never previously had at this scale: a reliable, stable, universally trusted unit of account and a secure mechanism for large value settlement. When merchants negotiated contracts, they could denominate them in bank guilders with confidence that the unit of value would not be manipulated. Credit became cheaper because trust became more reliable. The Bank of Amsterdam's model substantially influenced the development of institutions that would follow it across Europe. It is recognized by economic historians as one of the major ancestors of what we now call central banking, a concept that would be developed further by the Bank of England, established in 1694, and by central banks across the world in the centuries that followed. Now look at what had been built in Amsterdam between 1602 and roughly 1620. A publicly chartered corporation with transferable limited liability shares, a formal exchange where those shares and other financial instruments traded continuously. An institution providing stable currency and secure settlement that became one of the ancestors of central banking. A set of derivative instruments including futures, options, and short sales, allowing sophisticated management of financial risk. And surrounding all of this, a legal and commercial culture that enforced contracts reliably, protected property rights consistently, and treated financial innovation as a problem-solving exercise. This was not a financial system that happened to be in Amsterdam. This was a financial system that deeply influenced the development of financial systems around the world for centuries to come. The reason it was built here, rather than in London or Paris or Venice or Hamburg, was a specific combination of conditions: the geographic position requiring coordinated management of long-distance trade, the political framework of a republic giving merchant interests direct influence over policy, the cultural inheritance of collective problem-solving developed through centuries of water management, the influx of talent and capital from Antwerp bringing the most sophisticated commercial knowledge in Europe, the urgent strategic need to challenge a Portuguese and Spanish empire at global scale. Remove any one of these conditions and the story changes. Together they created a moment when the people who needed to build something new had the knowledge, the resources, the institutional capacity, and the political support to actually build it. They were not thinking about the future of capitalism. They were thinking about next year's spice cargo and whether the ships would come home. But something durable was being built, and Amsterdam in the early 17th century was the most commercially energized city in the world. Chapter 6. The Golden Age when Amsterdam ran the world. Walk along the Herengracht in Amsterdam on a morning in the year 1642. The canal smells of water and wood and the faint chemical tang of the dye works operating further along the bank. The houses on either side rise 4 and 5 stories. Their stepped and hooked gables cutting sharp profiles against a sky doing what Dutch skies do, providing the kind of luminous, cloud-filtered northern light that painters have been trying to capture and reproduce ever since. A canal boat moves slowly between the 2 rows of buildings, loaded with bolts of cloth. A merchant in a dark coat stands at the door of his warehouse overseeing the unloading of crates that have come from somewhere you would need a good map to find. The street smells of horse. Tobacco from the Virginian variety recently become popular. And bread baking in the bakeries, serving the thousands working in this neighborhood. It is, by almost any standard of the period, one of the most prosperous streets in the world. In 1642, Amsterdam had a population of somewhere around 150,000 people, one of the largest cities in Northern Europe. Its harbor was among the busiest in the world, with hundreds of ships coming and going continuously, carrying goods between the Baltic and the Atlantic, between Asia and Europe, between the Mediterranean and the North Sea, the VOC alone was operating a fleet of perhaps 150 vessels. A merchant navy larger than many contemporary states could field, as warships, the city's warehouses held spices, silks, sugar, grain, timber, copper, and dozens of other commodities from every corner of the trading world. Amsterdam, in the middle decades of the 17th century, was not just a successful trading city. It was something the world had not quite seen before. A city that had organized itself around the idea that the free movement of goods, capital, and people was the highest civic good, and that the institutions supporting that freedom were more valuable than almost anything else a city could possess. This is where the story of Amsterdam's tolerance requires honest examination, because the tolerance for which the Dutch Republic became famous was not, at its roots, philosophical idealism. The Amsterdam city government did not protect religious minorities because it had worked out a principled theory of natural rights. It did so because it had discovered, empirically, that tolerance was good for business. The Sephardic Jewish community coming from the Iberian Peninsula brought commercial networks extending across the entire Mediterranean world and into the Ottoman Empire. The Huguenot Protestants fleeing persecution in France brought skills in textile manufacture, silk weaving, diamond cutting, and glass making that Amsterdam needed. The Portuguese-born merchants who had converted to Christianity under coercion and maintained Jewish practice privately brought knowledge of the sugar trade in Brazil and the spice trade in Asia worth more than any single commodity. They handled. Expelling these communities would have been doctrinally satisfying to the stricter Calvinist clergy who sometimes pushed for it. It would also have been economically disastrous. The Amsterdam city fathers chose the economy, and in making that choice, they created something with moral value beyond its commercial utility. A city where a Jewish merchant could maintain a synagogue, where a Catholic could practice privately without persecution, where a man whose theological views were considered dangerous could publish his thoughts without immediately being imprisoned. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632, the son of a Portuguese Jewish merchant family that had found refuge in the city. He grew up speaking Portuguese and Dutch and Hebrew, and was by his early 20s one of the most radical thinkers in Europe. His philosophy argued that God and nature were the same thing, that the Bible was a human document whose contradictions were evidence of its human rather than divine origin, and that human freedom lay in understanding the causes determining our behavior. In almost any other city in Europe, Spinoza would have been imprisoned or executed. In Amsterdam, he was excommunicated from the Jewish community in 1656 and lived thereafter as a lens, grinder, and independent philosopher. He was not persecuted by the civil authorities. He was not harmed. He published and thought and corresponded with the leading intellectuals of Europe from the workshop of a city that had decided it had more important things to worry about than the metaphysics of a quiet craftsman who had overturned the Daan. Philosophical Foundations of Western Religion. René Descartes, the French mathematician and philosopher, chose to live in Amsterdam for much of the period between 1628 and 1649. In a letter to a friend, he described the Amsterdam of his time as a place where everyone was so absorbed in trade that he could live there with the freedom to think he needed, without being disturbed. He meant this as mild criticism of commercial preoccupation. What he was actually describing was a city so absorbed in the serious business of commerce that it had accidentally created exactly the conditions a philosopher required. Rembrandt Harmenszoon van Rijn arrived in Amsterdam from Leiden in 1631 or 1632, The Night Watch, completed in 1642, hangs today in the Rijksmuseum, a few minutes' walk from the house on the Jodenbriestraat where Rembrandt lived and worked. It was a commissioned group portrait. The 18 civic guardsmen depicted in it paid for the privilege. Roughly 100 guilders per figure by most historical accounts. What Rembrandt did with the commission: putting his subjects in motion, creating a scene rather than a formal arrangement, using light and shadow with a dramatic intensity that has generated argument and admiration ever since, turned a contractual obligation into one of the most studied paintings in Western art. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. One of the greatest paintings in Western art was produced because Amsterdam's merchant class was wealthy enough to commission portraits and confident enough in its own importance to want them. The Golden Age was not incidentally also an age of great painting. The art and the commerce were the same phenomenon. The same wealth that filled the warehouses and funded the VOC also commissioned Rembrandt and Jan Steen and Johannes Vermeer and Frans Hals. The same attention to the visible material world that made Amsterdam merchants careful accountants of physical reality also produced a tradition of painting defined by extraordinary attention to how light actually falls on actual objects. In actual rooms, the city's physical form was changing with its prosperity. The great canal ring that defines Amsterdam's famous urban layout, the 3 concentric semicircular canals of the Herengracht, the Keizersgracht, and the Prinsengracht, was planned in 1613 and built across the following decades. The canal houses lining these waterways today, their facades reflecting in the dark water below, are the physical record of an era when Amsterdam's merchant oligarchy was among the wealthiest comparable class anywhere in the world. Their narrowness was not aesthetic preference. It was fiscal. Property taxes in Amsterdam were assessed on the width of a building's frontage. A narrow house paid less tax than a wide one. The result was that straightforward economic incentives produced, over generations, an architectural uniformity that later centuries would mistake for deliberate artistic vision. Amsterdam was not beautiful by accident. It was beautiful because taxes made width expensive and height cheap. Amsterdam's position as the primary commercial entrepot of European commerce in the 17th century meant that commodity prices set in Amsterdam were effectively world prices. The Beurs set the price of spices for every market from London to Vienna. The credit terms available from Amsterdam's banking houses determined whether merchants in Hamburg or Bordeaux or Seville could fund their own operations. There is an important distinction to make about what Amsterdam actually was at its peak. Amsterdam was not simply the biggest or the richest city in Europe. Paris was larger. London was growing fast. Amsterdam's significance was not primarily about size. It was about function. Amsterdam was the city where prices were set, where credit was extended, where the financial instruments organizing global trade were developed and traded. It was the clearinghouse for the world economy of the 17th century. Its importance was structural rather than dimensional. The Dutch Republic of the 17th century was also the most important center of publishing in Europe. Books that could not legally be printed in France or England or Spain because of religious or political censorship were printed in Amsterdam and distributed across the continent. Descartes published here. Spinoza was published here posthumously. John Locke spent time in exile in the Republic before returning to England to write the political philosophy underpinning the glorious revolution of 1688. The flow of ideas through Amsterdam in the Golden Age was not incidental to its commercial success. It was part of the same system. Now step back and consider what is happening on that canal in 1642 with fresh eyes. A canal boat loaded with cloth from the Leyden textile mills. A warehouse receiving crates from Batavia. A counting house where a factor is settling a futures contract for pepper that has not yet left Asia. A printing house nearby where a manuscript in Latin is being typeset that will be read in Warsaw and Edinburgh within months. And above all of it, that luminous northern light falling on facades that are narrow because of tax law and tall because of ambition. This is not simply prosperity. This is a city where every function, commercial, intellectual, artistic, institutional, has been organized around the same underlying logic, that the free exchange of things, whether those things are goods or ideas or money or paintings, produces more than any alternative arrangement, and that the institutions protecting that exchange are worth more than the things they protect. The man in the dark coat, overseeing his crates at the warehouse door, does not think of himself as embodying a philosophy. He is checking whether the cargo matches the manifest. But the city he is standing in has organized itself around ideas that the rest of the world will spend the next 3 centuries trying to understand and replicate. The pressures building against that city were real. England was developing its own commercial and naval ambitions. France, under Louis XIV, was becoming a continental hegemon whose appetite for territorial expansion threatened the Republic's land borders. And within the Republic, the tensions between the merchant oligarchy and the supporters of the House of Orange, who wanted stronger executive authority, were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The man at the warehouse door did not feel those pressures on that particular morning. The light was good. The cargo was correct. The canal was busy with the traffic of a world that, for this moment, ran through here, for this moment, but the moment, like all moments, was already ending. Chapter 7. Tulip Mania and the First Financial Crash. In the winter of 1636, a weaver named Peter Willems made a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely rational. Pieter was not wealthy. He worked long hours in a textile workshop in Haarlem, a short distance from Amsterdam, and had modest savings accumulated over several years of careful living. But he had been watching the tulip market for months, and what he had seen was prices moving in one direction only. His neighbor had bought a contract for Semper Augustus bulbs the previous spring and sold that contract for twice what he paid. A baker 2 streets over had done something similar and bought a new cart with the profit. Everyone Peter knew was talking about it. The reasoning seemed simple. Prices were rising. People who had bought early were making money. The only obvious mistake was not buying. Pieter spent most of what he had saved on futures contracts for tulip bulbs. Within 8 weeks, those contracts were worthless. The story of the Tulip Mania is told, in most popular accounts, as a simple morality tale about collective irrationality. People went crazy over flowers. Prices reached absurd heights. The bubble burst. Lesson learned. The version most people have heard involves Dutch merchants selling their houses to buy a single bulb, only to be ruined when prices collapsed overnight. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely right either. And the parts it gets wrong are precisely the parts that matter most for understanding every financial crisis that has happened since. Start with why tulips were valuable in the first place. Because the value was not entirely irrational. The tulip arrived in the Western European market in the second half of the 16th century, originating in the Ottoman Empire and reaching the Low Countries through the botanist Carolus Clusius, who cultivated them at the Botanical Garden in Leyden from around 1593. They were exotic, visually striking, and susceptible to a mosaic virus that caused petals to develop intricate patterns of streaking and color breaking, transforming a uniformly colored flower into an object of extraordinary visual complexity. The most dramatically patterned varieties, the Semper Augustus and Viceroy types that commanded the highest prices, were genuinely rare and in real demand among wealthy collectors across Europe. The trade in rare tulip bulbs was a legitimate luxury market serving genuine demand. Prices were high because buyers were rich and supply was genuinely limited. This is how markets for scarce luxury goods work. It was not the starting point of the tulip trade that was irrational. It was where it ended up. What changed in the winter of 1636 and 1637 was the instrument being used to trade. Tulip bulbs grow underground and can only be physically transferred in summer when they are dormant. For most of the year, there are no physical bulbs to exchange. What had developed in the Dutch market by the mid-1630s was a practice of buying and selling contracts for future delivery. Agreements to pay a specified price for bulbs to be delivered the following summer. You could buy such a contract today and sell it tomorrow. The contract could change hands many times before the summer delivery date arrived. This mechanism had two effects that compounded each other catastrophically. First, it removed the physical constraint on market size. When trading required actual bulbs, the market was limited by the number of bulbs in existence. When trading moved to contracts for future delivery, there was no physical limit. Contracts could be written far exceeding the number of bulbs that would actually be available. The market became a market in promises rather than flowers. Second, it allowed participation by people who had no intention of ever taking delivery of a tulip bulb. Pieter Willems was not a horticulturalist. He was not a wealthy collector. He was trading contracts for profit on price movements, which is speculative futures trading. This is precisely the mechanism that Joseph de la Vega would describe in his account of the VOC share market later in the same century. In the tulip market, it spread rapidly through the winter of 1636, pulling in craftsmen, weavers, and small merchants who had never participated in commodity markets before and had no framework for assessing the risks they were taking. The prices recorded in that final speculative period had no relationship to any rational assessment of underlying value. A Semper Augustus bulb contract reportedly reached a price equivalent to multiple years of a skilled craftsman's wages at its peak. This was irrational, but the irrationality was a matter of degree rather than kind. It was a scarce luxury good in a market that had lost its connection to the underlying commodity. What collapsed it was a specific structural failure. In February of 1637, buyers failed to appear at a scheduled auction in Haarlem. Contracts that had been fully expected to sell did not sell. The precise reason remains debated by historians. One analysis suggests that a mild plague outbreak in the region made gatherings difficult and disrupted the social networks through which the market operated. Whatever the cause, the failure of buyers to appear signaled that demand had stalled. Holders of contracts who had been counting on selling at higher prices suddenly faced the possibility of having to take delivery of tulip bulbs they could not afford or had no use for. Sellers rushed to unload. Prices fell. More sellers panicked. Prices fell further. Within weeks, the market had collapsed. And here is the part the popular narrative consistently omits. The part that matters most. The economic damage to the Dutch Republic as a whole was relatively limited. This is not because the prices had been low or the trading volumes small. It is because the contracts being traded were largely unenforceable. The Dutch legal system of the period did not clearly recognize speculative futures contracts as legally binding obligations. When the market collapsed, and contract holders attempted to demand payment from those who had agreed to buy at peak prices, courts repeatedly declined to enforce the contracts, treating them essentially as gambling debts rather than commercial obligations. Peter Willems lost most of his savings. People like him, small-scale participants drawn in by the apparent easy money of a rising market, bore the worst of it. But very few were actually ruined in a way that destroyed their underlying commercial businesses. The financial system Amsterdam had built around VOC shares, the whistle bank, and legitimate commodity trade continued to function. The beurs continued to operate. The credit markets continued to extend capital to legitimate enterprises. What the Tulip Mania actually was, rather than an apocalypse, was a demonstration, observed and recorded with the detail-oriented attention that Amsterdam's commercial culture brought to everything. That futures markets, in the absence of adequate regulation and legal enforceability, could produce feedback loops driving prices far beyond any rational relationship to underlying value, and that when those loops reversed, they reversed quickly, violently, and without mercy for those caught on the wrong side. The mechanism is not historical. It is structural. In 2008, the instruments were mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps rather than tulip futures. The scale was incomparably larger, affecting hundreds of millions of people rather than thousands of Dutch merchants. But the underlying dynamic, the speculative inflation of prices through instruments disconnected from underlying value, the sudden reversal when confidence cracked, the asymmetric damage falling on those least able to absorb it, was recognizably the same dynamic that Peter Willems experienced in Haarlem in the winter of 1637. Peter went back to work in the spring. He rebuilt his savings slowly over the following years. He did not stop thinking about markets, but he thought about them differently. He became very interested in what something was actually worth before deciding what he would pay for it. That is not a minor thing. Every generation of investors has to learn it. Most learn it the same way Pieter did. Markets that move in only one direction do not exist. The only question is when the direction changes. Chapter 8. The Rampjaar, the year, everything almost ended. There is a Dutch word that has no clean equivalent in English. Rampjaar. Ramp means disaster. Jaar means year. Together, they name something so total and so sudden that the Dutch language needed a single compound word to hold it. It refers to the year 1672, a year that began with the Dutch Republic at the apparent peak of its confidence, a year that nearly ended with its complete destruction. By 1670, the Republic was, by most measures, the most commercially powerful state in the world. Its merchant fleet was larger than those of England and France combined. Amsterdam's financial markets set commodity prices for the entire European economy. The VOC operated across Asia with an autonomy that made it functionally a state within a state. Dutch science. In the work of Christian Huygens, who developed the pendulum clock and made foundational contributions to optics and mechanics. And Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who was at this moment beginning to use microscopes to discover the existence of microorganisms nobody had known existed, was at the leading edge of what would later be called the scientific revolution. The Republic was governed, in the absence of a stadtholder, by its Grand Pensionary. From 1653, that position was held by Johan de Witt, a man of extraordinary intelligence and administrative capacity who had guided the Republic through 2 previous wars with England. De Witt believed the Republic's strength lay in its commercial and financial institutions, not in military power organized around a strong executive. He invested in the navy but kept the army relatively weak, relying on diplomacy and commercial advantage to manage relations with neighbors. This strategy had worked for nearly 20 years. What it had not accounted for was Louis XIV of France. Louis was, by 1672, probably the most powerful individual in Europe, ruling a kingdom of roughly 20 million people with an absolute authority expressed from the Palace of Versailles. He had been watching the Dutch Republic with a mixture of economic resentment and genuine contempt. The Dutch were, in Louis's understanding of the world, merchants, people without nobility of blood who had accumulated more wealth and commercial influence than kingdoms with ancient legitimacy. Their republic was an affront to everything he believed a properly organized society should be. He also had specific grievances. Dutch trade competed directly with French trade across multiple markets. Dutch financial houses extended credit to his enemies. Dutch pamphleteers had produced scathing criticism of his government, and the Dutch had organized diplomatic opposition to his attempt to annex the Spanish Netherlands in 1668. Louis spent the years between 1668 and 1672 building an army widely estimated at over 100,000 men. He secured diplomatic agreements with England and with German bishops whose territories bordered the Republic to the east. He prepared with the patience of someone who intended to do the job once and completely. On the 12th of May, 1672, he launched his invasion. The Dutch army of roughly 25,000 had no realistic chance of stopping it. French forces crossed the Rhine in late June at a point Dutch defensive strategy had assessed as extremely difficult. The defensive line collapsed. Within weeks, 3 of the 7 provinces were under French control. In Amsterdam, the reaction was panic, of a kind the city had not experienced in living memory. The exchange rate of the guilder collapsed. Depositors rushed to the Whistlebank to withdraw their holdings. VOC shares fell sharply. Merchants who had built their lives on the assumption of the Republic's permanence began calculating what they could move and where. Into this atmosphere of mounting catastrophe came a political crisis as dangerous as the French army. The pressure to give William III, the young Prince of Orange. Military command became irresistible. In July, he was appointed stadtholder and captain general. He was 21 years old. What followed was not a reasoned political transition. On the 20th of August 1672, Johann de Witt and his brother Cornelis were in The Hague. Cornelis had been imprisoned on charges that most historians view as politically motivated. Johann had come to visit him. As the brothers attempted to leave the prison, a mob attacked them. What followed was one of the most brutal episodes in Dutch history. The brothers were beaten and shot. Their bodies were mutilated. The civic guards who might have protected them stood aside. The investigation that followed produced no significant prosecutions. William III, who had been informed trouble was brewing and had the power to intervene, did not act. The evidence for his prior knowledge or complicity is circumstantial, and historians assess it differently. What is clear is that the murders served his political interests and that he chose not to prevent them. The De Witt brothers died in a street in The Hague, and William became the uncontested executive authority of the Republic. The military salvation came from where it always had: the water. The decision to open the dikes and flood the land between Amsterdam and the advancing French forces was made in late June, as it became clear that conventional resistance could not stop them. The consequences were severe. Thousands of acres of agricultural land went under water. Villages and farms that had been inhabited for generations were lost. The economic damage was enormous. But French cavalry cannot ride across a flooded polder. French infantry cannot move through chest-deep water. The advance stopped at the waterline. Amsterdam held. William proved considerably more effective as a military commander than his enemies had anticipated. He did not win by defeating France in the field. He won by doing what Dutch statecraft had always done at its best: constructing a coalition large enough to make continuing the war too costly for Louis. He brought Brandenburg and the Holy Roman Empire into the conflict against France. The war dragged on until 1678, when the Treaty of Nijmegen ended the hostilities. The Republic had survived. Its territory was largely restored. Its financial institution, shaken but not destroyed, continued functioning. But the Republic that emerged from 1672 was not the one that had entered it. The political balance between merchant oligarchy and House of Orange had shifted permanently in Orange's favor. The confidence that commercial power alone was sufficient basis for national security had been destroyed. And the lesson that military strength required resources the Republic's decentralized structure was poorly equipped to mobilize had been written in blood. William III spent the following years applying that lesson on a larger stage. In 1677, he married Mary, daughter of the Duke of York and heir to the English throne. In 1688, invited by English politicians who had concluded that King James II's Catholic sympathies were incompatible with English Protestant interests, William crossed the Channel with a Dutch army and landed in Devon. James II fled without fighting. William and Mary were crowned joint sovereigns of England. Within 6 years of William's accession, the Bank of England was founded, drawing substantially on practices developed in Amsterdam. Among other influences, a national debt mechanism was established. The structures of English public finance were rebuilt, in important ways, on Dutch foundations alongside other influences. The Dutch and Huguenot financiers who accompanied William to England many of whom had first found refuge in the Republic before following him to his new kingdom, carried the practical expertise the new institutions required. The great irony of the Rampjaar and its aftermath is precise. The crisis that nearly destroyed the Dutch Republic was also the crisis that spread its financial innovations to the country that would eventually supersede it. Louis XIV had tried to crush the Dutch commercial system by force. He failed. But the pressure he applied caused that system to be transplanted to England, where it found a larger country, a growing empire, and the combination of Atlantic trade and industrial capacity that would eventually make London the financial center of the world. Amsterdam had, in the worst year of its history, accidentally exported the model that would one day reduce its own dominance. That is not the kind of thing you see coming. Almost nothing important in history announces itself clearly in advance. Chapter 9. The Slow Decline and What Britain Took. In 1708, a Dutch merchant named Jacob Bicker sat in his counting-house on the Herengracht and looked at the figures in front of him. Jacob is a composite figure, representative of the Amsterdam merchant class at the turn of the 18th century. But the numbers he was looking at were real, and they were telling a story that merchants of his generation were beginning to understand with growing clarity, even if none of them yet had words for it. The volumes of trade moving through Amsterdam were still substantial. The Wisselbank still processed payments. The VOC still paid dividends. On paper, everything was working. But the margin on almost every transaction was thinner than it had been 20 years ago. The English ships were carrying cargoes that Dutch ships had carried a generation earlier. The credit extended from London counting houses was competing directly with credit from Amsterdam on terms that were increasingly favourable to London. The new commercial ventures generating the largest profits were organised in London rather than here. Jacob closed his accounts book and looked out the window at the canal. The water was moving in that slow, deliberate way it always moved in November, dark and cold and entirely indifferent to the calculations taking place in the buildings along its banks. He did not know the word for what he was watching happen. Nobody did yet. But he was watching it happen. The decline of Amsterdam and the rise of London as the center of global finance happened over decades, through the accumulation of decisions and circumstances that no individual fully understood as they were occurring. It looked less like a transfer of power than like a gradual shift of gravity. The English Navigation Acts are the clearest example of a deliberate policy intervention designed to redirect commercial advantage. The English Parliament passed the first significant Navigation Act in 1651, requiring that goods imported into England or its colonies be carried either in English ships or in ships from the country producing the goods. The target was explicit. Dutch merchant ships carried an enormous proportion of England's seaborne trade. The Acts were designed to force that traffic onto English ships. The Acts generated 3 Anglo-Dutch wars across the following decades. The Dutch proved more resilient naval opponents than anticipated. But the cumulative effect of the legislation, sustained across decades regardless of the military outcome of specific conflicts, was to redirect significant shipping business from Dutch to English carriers. This mattered beyond the shipping revenues themselves. Commercial shipping in the age of sail was the information network of the age. The captains and factors and agents who moved goods between ports were also moving knowledge. contacts, commercial intelligence, and the personal relationships on which credit depended. Every cargo that moved on an English ship was a transaction whose informational value accrued to English commercial networks rather than Dutch ones. Over decades, the cumulative informational advantage compounded. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was chartered as a lending institution from the beginning, which gave it a structural advantage over the Amsterdam Wisselbank that the Wisselbank's own principles prevented it from matching. The Bank of England's first act was to lend £1,200,000 to the English government in exchange for a charter granting it the right to operate as a joint stock bank. The interest it received was paid from revenues of the English state. This created a structure in which the bank's commercial success was directly aligned with the fiscal health of the government, and in which the government had access to credit on terms no previous English monarch could have imagined. The consequences compounded over decades. England could borrow money at interest rates reflecting its creditworthiness as a stable state rather than the personal creditworthiness of its monarch. When wars came, and they came continuously through the 18th century, England could fund them through borrowing in ways that France could not match with comparable efficiency. Each major conflict of the 18th century demonstrated, in different ways, the advantage that the English system of public finance gave to a country that had learned, partly through Dutch example and partly through its own institutional development, how to organize the relationship between government and capital. The VOC's internal decline was equally instructive. The company had been founded as a solution to a specific problem. The solution worked brilliantly. But the organizational structure that made it work in 1602 was the same structure making it increasingly dysfunctional a century later. The directors, the Heren 17, had become sclerotic and prone to prioritizing factional interests over commercial health. Corruption in the Asian operations was endemic and documented. Dividend payments were maintained at historically high levels long past the point where actual trading profits could justify them. Paid from capital reserves, the company could not afford to deplete. This pattern, an organizational structure that was innovative and effective in the conditions that produced it, becoming a constraint when conditions change, while those holding power within it resist the reforms that would diminish their own authority, has been identified repeatedly in the centuries since the VOC's decline. The VOC was formally dissolved in 1798. Its assets and debts, absorbed by the Batavian Republic, established following Napoleon's invasion. By that point, the company had been effectively insolvent for years. Jacob Bicker, had he lived long enough to see the dissolution, would have recognized it not as a surprise, but as the conclusion of a process already visible in the numbers on his desk in 1708. The gap between what the VOC reported and what it actually earned had been widening for decades. He had seen it in the margins. He had not known what to do about it. Neither had anyone else. There is a specific quality to the kind of loss Amsterdam experienced. By 1750, the city was still prosperous by almost any standard except comparison with itself. The canal houses were standing. The paintings were on the walls. What was gone was the sense of necessity, the feeling that the conversations happening here were the ones determining how the world worked. What Amsterdam could not have known was that the mechanisms it had created were so generative that once released into the world they would keep growing long after their point of origin had been superseded. The Bank of England, built substantially on Dutch foundations, eventually became one of the models for central banks across the world. The English joint stock company structure, built substantially on VOC foundations, became the template for the modern corporation. The secondary market in shares that began around the dam in Amsterdam is among the direct ancestors of modern stock exchanges. Amsterdam had given the world a set of tools. The world had taken them and built things with them that dwarfed anything Amsterdam had imagined. Jacob Bicker, closing his accounts book in 1708 and looking at the canal, was sitting at the center of a city that had changed the world and was now watching the world move on without it. That is a particular kind of ending, not defeat, not destruction, something quieter and in some ways harder to carry. Before Amsterdam's deeper capacity for reinvention was called upon again, the city had one more catastrophe to survive, the worst one yet. Chapter 10. Occupation, Resistance, and the darkest chapter. Begin with a number. 107,000. That is the number of Jewish men, women, and children deported from the Netherlands during the German occupation of the Second World War. Of those 107,000, approximately 5,500 returned. The rest were murdered in the camps. According to research by the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, and figures compiled by Yad Vashem, approximately 75% of the Jewish population of the Netherlands was killed, one of the highest rates of any occupied country in Western Europe. In France, despite the collaboration of the French state in deportations, approximately 75% of Jews survive. In Belgium, approximately 60% survived. In the Netherlands, the numbers were nearly reversed, a fact that demands explanation because it is not accidental. Before the occupation, there is a century of Dutch history to place it in. Napoleon entered the Dutch Republic in 1795, establishing a French satellite state. His brother Louis was made King of Holland in 1806. Napoleon annexed the Netherlands directly into the French Empire in 1810. After Napoleon fell, the Dutch were incorporated into the Kingdom of the Netherlands under the House of Orange in 1815. The 19th century brought gradual commercial and industrial revival. The Noordzee Canal, opened in 1876, gave Amsterdam direct, deep-water access to the North Sea. Re-establishing maritime connections, the silting of the IJ had progressively compromised. The diamond industry expanded. The harbour grew busier as colonial trade through the Dutch East Indies generated increasing traffic. The population grew from around 220,000 in 1850 to nearly 500,000 by 1900. But the conditions in which many people lived were not comfortable. The working-class neighborhoods of the Jordan district were overcrowded and poorly ventilated. Dutch social reformers who documented conditions in the late 19th century produced surveys that were, in their methodological care and moral seriousness, as compelling as anything produced elsewhere in Europe. The Jewish community of Amsterdam, by 1940, was one of the oldest and most established in Western Europe. Jews had been living in Amsterdam since the late 16th century, drawn by the combination of religious tolerance and commercial opportunity that the Dutch Republic had offered. By 1940, Approximately 80,000 Jews lived in Amsterdam, the largest Jewish community in the Netherlands. They were Dutch citizens. They spoke Dutch. They attended Dutch schools and worked in Dutch institutions. The centuries of tolerance that had made Amsterdam the refuge for Spinoza's family had produced, 4 centuries later, a community whose Dutchness was as deep and genuine as that of any other group in the city. The German Wehrmacht entered the Netherlands on the 10th of May, 1940. The Dutch military resisted for 5 days. Rotterdam was bombed with such severity on the 14th of May, killing approximately 900 civilians and destroying the center of the city, that the Dutch commander-in-chief agreed to a ceasefire rather than see the same fate visited on other Dutch cities. Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government fled to London. On the 15th of May, the Netherlands surrendered. The Nazi administration that took control approached the Netherlands as a special case. The Dutch were considered racially acceptable by Nazi ideology. The policy was to make the occupation comfortable for the Dutch population while systematically implementing racial laws that the Nazi state applied wherever it governed. The persecution of Dutch Jews was implemented methodically and incrementally. Registration first, then exclusion from public life, then physical concentration into specific neighborhoods, then the Yellow Star, required from May 1942. Each step was implemented with the bureaucratic thoroughness the Nazi administration brought to everything. And each step was complied with by the Dutch civil service to a degree that later reckoning found difficult to accept. The Dutch bureaucratic infrastructure was efficient. The population registration system was comprehensive. The railway system was reliable. When the deportations began, the German administration found in place exactly the institutional machinery it needed to make the process systematic. The deportations from Amsterdam began in July 1942. The transit camp at Westerbork in the northeastern Netherlands, originally established by the Dutch government before the war for Jewish refugees from Germany, became the deportation hub through which Amsterdam's Jews passed on their way to Auschwitz and Sobibor. Week after week, trains left Westerbork for the east. There was resistance. Dutch people hid Jewish neighbors and strangers at enormous personal risk. An estimated 20,000 to 30,000 Dutch Jews survived the war by going into hiding, a number requiring the courage of many thousands of non-Jewish Dutch people who provided shelter. Food, false papers, and silence. The February strike of 1941, in which Amsterdam workers staged a general strike to protest the first major roundup of Jewish men in the city, was one of the very few recorded mass protests against Jewish persecution anywhere in Nazi-occupied Europe. It lasted 2 days before the German administration suppressed it. But the numbers require honesty. The people who helped were a minority. The institutions that processed the deportations, the Dutch police who conducted many of the roundups, the railway workers who operated the trains to Westerbork, the civil servants who maintained the registers, performed their functions. Most Dutch people were not actively complicit in the destruction of their Jewish neighbors. Most also did not resist it. They did what people do under occupation. They tried to survive. They tried not to see what they were choosing not to see. The Frank family, Otto Frank and his wife Edith, and their daughters Margot and Anne, went into hiding in the concealed apartment at Prinsengracht 263 in July 1942. They were joined by 4 others. They hid for 25 months. They were betrayed to the German authorities in August 1944 and deported to Auschwitz. Edith Frank died in Auschwitz in January 1945. Margot and Anne were transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where both died of typhus in February or March of 1945, weeks before the camp's liberation. Otto Frank was the only member of the family to survive. The diary Anne kept during the hiding years was found by Miep Gies, one of the helpers. After the family's arrest, Otto Frank, returning to Amsterdam after liberation and learning that his daughters were dead, read it and arranged for its publication. The Diary of a Young Girl was first published in the Netherlands in 1947. It has since been translated into more than 70 languages and is among the most widely read books in the world. The house at Prinsengracht 263 is now the Anne Frank House, one of the most visited sites in the Netherlands. Standing in the concealed apartment, which is remarkably small for 8 people who lived in it for over 2 years, and looking at the wall where Anne pasted pictures of movie stars and the Dutch royal family, is one of those experiences that resists all attempts to prepare for it with prior knowledge. You know the story before you walk in. You know how it ends. It still lands with a weight that no amount of knowing can cushion. The liberation of the Western Netherlands came in May 1945 after the German surrender. But the winter of 1944 to 1945, the Hunger Winter, had by then killed somewhere between 18,000 and 22,000 people in the Western Netherlands through famine caused by a German blockade combined with an unusually harsh winter. In Amsterdam, people burned their furniture for heat. They ate tulip bulbs. The tulip bulbs that had been the symbol of the city's greatest speculative excess 3 centuries earlier became, in the winter of 1944 and 1945, food for a starving population. That connection across centuries is not poetic. It is simply what happened. Canadian forces entered Amsterdam on the 8th of May, 1945. The liberation was celebrated with a joy that photographs from the period convey, with an immediacy that still reaches across the decades. People climbed onto the tanks. Streets that had been silent and frightened for 5 years were full of noise and light, and people who had been waiting for this moment without being certain it would come. In 2020, the Dutch government formally apologized for the role of Dutch authorities in the Holocaust. It was 75 years after the liberation. That it had taken so long was itself a form of acknowledgement. Amsterdam had experienced catastrophes before: plague and flood and military disaster and financial collapse. It had always come back. This one was different. What was destroyed was not buildings or financial systems. It was people, 80,000 people who had been part of the city, whose families had been part of the city for generations, who were Dutch in every sense that word should carry. They did not come back, and Amsterdam has been living with that absence ever since. Chapter 11. Reconstruction, Counterculture, and the city that reinvented itself. The spring of 1945 came slowly to Amsterdam. The Canadian forces, who entered on the 8th of May, were met with celebrations that photographs capture in their full joy. People climbing on tanks, flowers appearing from windows that had been shuttered for years, faces looking directly at the camera with expressions that mix relief and exhaustion in proportions that are difficult to separate. But behind those celebrations, The city those soldiers were entering was depleted in ways that would take years to fully understand. The hunger winter had killed thousands. The infrastructure had deteriorated. The Jewish community that had been one of the defining elements of Amsterdam's identity for 3.5 centuries had been largely destroyed. The neighborhood around the Waterloop line, once the heart of Jewish Amsterdam, was quieter than it had been since before the 17th century. The buildings were intact. Most of the people who had prayed in them were gone. The reckoning with what had happened, and with the Dutch role in enabling it, was slow and incomplete. The post-war narrative emphasized resistance over collaboration, heroism over complicity. It took decades for a fuller accounting to emerge, and in 2020, the Dutch government's formal apology acknowledged that the accounting had taken too long. The reconstruction of the physical city proceeded with practical urgency through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Housing was the most pressing need. Amsterdam's population was growing again, and the city government commissioned large residential developments on the periphery. Rational, modernist housing blocks designed according to the social democratic principles the Dutch welfare state was being built on. Adequate space, adequate light, adequate sanitation. The housing was built. It served its purpose. Most people who lived in it were glad to have it. The discovery of natural gas in the Groningen field in 1959 proved to be one of the largest gas reserves in Europe and provided the financial foundation for a welfare state expansion that made the Netherlands one of the most comprehensively provided for societies in the world through the 1960s and 70s. But the most distinctive thing that happened in Amsterdam during these decades was not the economic recovery or the welfare state expansion. Walk through the Jordan neighborhood on a spring evening in 1966. On the corner of the Spuistraat, a crowd has gathered around something that looks like, but is not quite, a political demonstration. There are people with paint on their hands. Someone is riding a white bicycle in slow circles. A young man is reading aloud from what appears to be a plan for redesigning the city's transportation system. Though the plan involves provisions that no serious transportation ministry would consider, these people call themselves the Provos. The Provos were not a political party. They were not an organization in any conventional sense. They were a sensibility, a willingness to make the streets of Amsterdam a theater for ideas about how a city should work and who it should work for. Their name came from the Dutch word provocatie. They meant it. Their method was to provoke the authorities into reactions that would expose the gap between Amsterdam's self-image as a tolerant and enlightened city and its actual behavior when that tolerance was tested. The White Bicycle Plan, proposed in 1965, suggested the city provide a fleet of unlocked white-painted bicycles available for anyone to use and leave anywhere, eliminating the need for car traffic in the center. It was anarchic, impractical in the form proposed, and immediately influential on urban planners across the world. The idea of shared public bicycles, now implemented in cities from New York to Paris to Shanghai, has direct intellectual ancestry in what a group of Amsterdam provocateurs proposed 6 decades ago. The coronation of Princess Beatrix in 1966 generated the most significant confrontation between Provo energy and state authority. Smoke bombs thrown near the carriage carrying Beatrix and her German husband Klaus von Amsberg triggered a police response that many observers considered disproportionate and that was widely photographed and reported. The images circulated internationally and contributed to the city's emerging reputation as the European capital of something genuinely new. The Provos dissolved themselves in 1967. Having demonstrated that the space existed, the squatter movement that followed occupied several hundred buildings in Amsterdam at its peak in the early 1980s, ranging from single apartments to entire blocks. The culture that developed within and around these spaces produced music, visual art, and social experiments that fed into the broader culture of the city in ways that outlasted the specific communities generating them. The Dutch approach to drug policy, which decriminalized the personal use and small-scale sale of cannabis in the coffee shop system, formalized in 1976, was not the product of idealism about human freedom. It was the product of a specifically Dutch pragmatism about harm reduction. The evidence suggested that criminalization was producing more harm than the drug itself. The logical response, consistent with the waterboard tradition of addressing the actual problem rather than the preferred version of it, was to regulate rather than prohibit. The same logic applied to policies on sex work, on needle exchange programs for intravenous drug users, on the provision of methadone to heroin addicts. Each policy was controversial. Each generated criticism from more conservative European neighbors, and each was, in the assessment of public health researchers who studied the outcomes, broadly more effective at reducing harm than prohibition-based approaches used elsewhere. This is the pattern that the Provo culture and the squatter movement and the drug policy liberalization all share beneath their surface differences. They are all expressions of the same underlying cultural disposition that water management had built into the Dutch character over 7 centuries. You solve the problem that actually exists. You do not solve the problem you would prefer to have. You share the costs and benefits of the solution across the community. And you do not confuse the emotional satisfaction of taking a strong moral position with the practical effectiveness of the policy that position generates. The economy of Amsterdam through the 1980s and 90s was diversifying in ways that would eventually position the city for its 21st century role. The financial sector was growing. The logistics sector was strengthening, with Schiphol Airport becoming one of the busiest cargo hubs in Europe. The technology sector was beginning to form. And the same combination of attributes that had made Amsterdam the commercial brain of the 17th century world was making it, once again, an unusually attractive place for talent and capital from everywhere. The tolerance, the openness, the willingness to accept people from different places with different ideas. It had been commercial strategy in the Golden Age. It had been political philosophy in the Provo years. It was becoming, by the late 20th century, a genuine civic identity, something Amsterdam was rather than something Amsterdam performed for practical reasons. The city that had begun as a dam on a small river was arriving at the end of the 20th century with something it had not set out to create and could not have created deliberately: a character. And the question of what a city with that character would do with the 21st century was about to receive an answer it had not anticipated. Chapter 12. Amsterdam in the Age of Overtourism and Digital Capital. Stand at the corner of the Leidseplein on a Friday evening in July 2019 and try to walk in a straight line. You cannot do it, not because the ground is uneven, Though Amsterdam's paving is famously irregular and the canals have been slowly pulling the foundations of the surrounding streets out of alignment for centuries, you cannot walk in a straight line because there are too many people. Not Amsterdammers going to dinner or meeting friends. Tourists, thousands of them, from every country, speaking every language, pulling rolling suitcases that catch on the cobblestones, consulting phones showing directions to the nearest coffee shop or the Anne Frank house where they have a timed entry starting in 20 minutes. According to data published by Amsterdam Tourism and Convention Board, the city received approximately 19 million visitors in 2019. The permanent population was approximately 900,000. More than 20 visitors for every resident, one of the highest ratios of any major European city. Greet Visser grew up in the Jordan district, the same working-class neighborhood where the Provos had gathered in 1966. In an apartment her parents had rented since 1972, the neighborhood she grew up in was not beautiful in the way tourists mean when they say that word. It was loud and close and full of people who knew each other and had opinions about each other and shared walls thin enough to hear both sides of most arguments. In 2017, after the building was sold, the new owners converted the upper floors to tourist lets and raised the ground floor rents to market rates. Greet is a composite figure, but her situation is representative of thousands of documented cases. She moved to a suburb 20 minutes by tram from the city centre. She still comes in for work. She still loves the canal light in the early morning before the tour groups arrive. But the city no longer feels like the city belongs to her the way it once did. She is not alone in that feeling. The problem was structural and had been building for decades. The historic centre, the UNESCO World Heritage listed canal ring, was genuinely extraordinary and also small. The Grachtengordel covers roughly 1 square kilometre. 1 square kilometre of 17th century architecture, of hump-backed bridges and stepped gable rooflines and dark water reflecting amber streetlight. And millions of people per year wanting to walk through it. When that many people want to be in one place, the place changes. The shops that served residents gave way to shops that served visitors. Neighborhood supermarkets became souvenir emporia. Butchers and bookshops became restaurants serving simplified Dutch cuisine to people who would be gone by tomorrow. And the apartments above all of this were changing too. The short-term rental platforms that emerged in the early 2010s, Airbnb foremost among them, transformed the economics of owning property in Amsterdam's historic centre. A canal house apartment generating perhaps €12,000 per year as a long-term rental could generate 3 or 4 times that as a short-term tourist let. The incentive was simple, powerful, and devastating in its cumulative effect. Residents sold or converted. The permanent population of the historic centre declined. The Amsterdam city government responded with measures that were, in aggregate, among the most assertive attempts by any European city to manage the tourism problem. Short-term rentals were progressively restricted. The annual limit on private home rentals was reduced from 60 nights to 30 nights and then restricted further in specific districts. Cruise ships were required to use a terminal further from the historic core. New hotels in the canal ring were prohibited. The red light district was subjected to progressive restrictions as part of a broader policy of reducing concentration of mass tourism. The measures worked. Partially, the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 provided an involuntary interruption that the city used to accelerate its tourism management policies and consult with residents about what kind of city they wanted to be. The question Amsterdam was asking itself is the same one every city that becomes a tourist destination must eventually confront. When the experience of a place becomes a product, who is the product for? And what happens to the place itself when the product it is selling is the authenticity that mass visitation destroys? The Brexit vote of 2016 had consequences for Amsterdam that were largely positive from a purely economic perspective. When British financial institutions assessed which European cities they would need to expand operations in, Amsterdam was consistently near the top of the list. The combination of English language fluency, strong legal system, financial sector infrastructure, Schiphol Airport's connectivity, and institutional familiarity with financial services made it a natural destination. Several significant financial institutions established or expanded European headquarters in Amsterdam in the years following the referendum. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, known as Euronext Amsterdam and tracing its lineage directly to the Beurs that opened in 1611, saw its trading volumes increase as some activities previously flowing through London were redirected to continental venues. The Netherlands as a whole also occupies, through one of its technology companies, a position in the global supply chain that is structurally distinctive. ASMO, headquartered in Eindhoven in the south of the Netherlands rather than in Amsterdam, manufactures the photolithography machines used to etch circuit patterns onto semiconductor chips. Its extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, known as EUV machines, represent the cutting edge of what humanity currently knows how to build in precision manufacturing. As of 2026, the most advanced semiconductor chips, particularly those at cutting-edge process nodes powering the artificial intelligence systems transforming the global economy, depend on EUV lithography that only ASML produces. No other company anywhere in the world makes comparable EUV machines. The United States government's export controls on this equipment to China, implemented through pressure on the Dutch government beginning in the early 2020s, are a direct acknowledgement of this indispensability. ASML is an Eindhoven company rooted in the Philips industrial tradition of the Dutch South, not in Amsterdam's merchant and financial tradition, but the broader Dutch ecosystem that made ASML possible, the research universities, the engineering culture, the international trade orientation, the access to European markets, is one that the Netherlands as a whole has developed. With Amsterdam as its financial and cultural centre contributing to the national platform that companies like ASML build on. A Dutch company, in a country of 18 million people, sits at the intersection of the most significant geopolitical technology competition of the 21st century. The VOC had a monopoly on nutmeg enforced by military power. ASML has something stranger and, in some ways, more complete. A technological monopoly enforced by the simple fact that nobody else currently knows how to do what it does. The Amsterdam of 2026 is a city of approximately 900,000 people in the city proper and roughly 2.5 million in the greater metropolitan area. It is the financial and cultural capital of the Netherlands and the primary international gateway to a country that continues to punch substantially above its demographic and geographic weight in the global economy. The housing crisis remains unresolved. Property prices in Amsterdam remain among the highest in Western Europe relative to local incomes. Young Amsterdammers struggle to afford to live in the city they grew up in. The demographic mix of the historic centre is becoming progressively less representative of the wider city. And the climate mathematics have not changed. Amsterdam sits somewhere between 0.5 metre and 1 metre below sea level on average. The sea level projections for the North Sea over the coming century, which the Dutch government's Delta program monitors and updates continuously, indicate a range of scenarios requiring ongoing investment in water management infrastructure. The Delta program is one of the most sophisticated programs of climate adaptation anywhere in the world. It is also a reminder that the existential challenge defining Amsterdam's relationship with its environment since the 13th century has not been solved. It has been managed, and management is not a permanent solution. It is a continuous process requiring continuous commitment. The canals that tourists photograph are not decorative. They are, as they have always been, drainage. The beauty of Amsterdam is inseparable from its engineering, and the engineering, as it has always been, is inseparable from the continuing negotiation between a city and the water that surrounds and underlies everything it has ever built. Greet Visser still takes the tram in on some mornings. When the light on the canals is right and the tour groups have not yet gathered, she still loves the city. The city is still figuring out whether it can love her back the way it once did. Go back to the beginning. Go back to Hendrik, checking his drainage ditch on a grey morning in the late 13th century, not because history had chosen him for anything, but because if he did not check it, the field flooded. Go back to Willem Claes in his warehouse by the dam, calculating whether a Baltic voyage was worth the risk. Learning through that calculation the habits of mind that his city would eventually turn into the financial architecture that much of the modern corporate world still runs on. Go back to Maria Pipes standing in the doorway of her Antwerp house watching soldiers loot her neighbour's warehouse, making the calculation that would bring tens of thousands of people like her northward to a city that knew how to use what they knew. None of them were thinking about the future of capitalism. None of them knew they were building something that 400 years later would still be shaping how money moves through the world. They were solving the problems in front of them with the tools available and the habits of mind they had inherited from the people who came before. The tools they created together: the Limited Liability Corporation, the secondary market in transferable shares, the institutional ancestors of central banking, the Commodity Futures Exchange, the integrated financial system connecting savings to investment at continental scale, did not remain in Amsterdam. They travelled first to London, then to New York, then to every financial market on earth, every pension fund holding the retirement savings of working people, every stock exchange where companies raise capital, every central bank managing the monetary system of its country. The VOC Charter helped create the modern corporation. The Beurs helped create the modern stock exchange. The Wisselbank helped create the central banking tradition. All of it traces some part of its intellectual lineage back to a city below sea level at the mouth of a small river. Amsterdam did not invent all of this from nothing. Venice had the maritime insurance. Genoa had the long-distance credit. Italian partnerships had early versions of shared investment. But Amsterdam was the place where these pieces were assembled, systematically and at scale, into something that worked well enough to become the template that spread to the rest of the world. And the city itself, the dam, is buried somewhere beneath the paving stones of the dam square. The physical structure of earth and timber and stone that gave this city its name. It has not functioned as a dam for many centuries. The river it once controlled has been managed into irrelevance by the same engineering ambition that has been redirecting water in this part of the world since before anyone thought to write any of it down. The canals still run. The water still moves. The same water that the first settlers fought to keep off their fields, that the medieval merchants sailed to build their first trade networks, that the VOC ships navigated on their way to Asia, that the Canadian liberators crossed through on their way into the city in May of 1945, that the tourists photograph without knowing they are looking at the functional infrastructure of a city still in active negotiation with an element that has never cared about its history, its art, its financial innovations, or its fame. The water does not care. It only asks one question: are you going to keep building? Hendrik checked his drainage ditch every morning because the answer was always yes. It still is.